March 8, 1917. After years of war, Russia is starving. People are hungry, soldiers are dying, and the Tsar sits in his palace, completely out of touch. But on this day, something snaps. Women textile workers in the city's factories decide they've had enough. They leave their machines, throw on their scarves, and walk out into the streets. Their chants start simple. They chant for bread. And as they march, they hit the factory gates, banging on doors, shouting for workers to join them. One by one, those gates open, and men pour out to join the march. By the end of the week, what started as a cry for bread on a freezing March morning became the spark that brought down 300 years of Romanov rule and reshaped the world forever. Using cutting-edge AI tools such as image generation, image-to-video tools, and text-to-speech, history itself has been resurrected. Real photos from 1917 have been transformed into vivid, moving images, their stillness shattered to reveal the lives behind the lens. Other visuals have been reimagined from the ground up, capturing the raw spirit and energy of an era on the brink of change. Together, they unveil the Russian Revolution as it has never been seen before. For 3 grueling years, Russia had been entrenched in World War I, suffering devastating losses. Millions of soldiers were dead or maimed, while those who remained endured brutal conditions at the front, freezing in trenches, poorly armed, and increasingly demoralized. Desertions soared as soldiers saw no purpose in sacrificing their lives for a war that seemed unwinnable. In Petrograd, the war had drained the city of its lifeblood. Bread, the most basic staple, was rationed, but the rations fell far short of what families needed to survive. Women, the backbone of the city's households, bore the brunt of this crisis. Each morning, they stood for hours in freezing bread lines, hoping to scrape together enough food for their children. Prices for the meager supplies available spiraled out of reach, plunging the poorest, the factory workers and peasants, into deeper despair. Meanwhile, Tsar Nicholas II remained woefully disconnected from the suffering of his people. Cloistered in his opulent palaces, he clung to the delusion of his divine right to rule, issuing decrees that ignored the dire reality outside his walls. Reforms were dismissed, dissent was crushed, and parliament had been silenced. For the people of Petrograd, there was no legitimate avenue to voice their grievances, no hope for change from above. By early March, the strain on the city had reached a breaking point. The streets were filled with whispers of revolt, and the long bread lines became symbols of a government that had failed its people. Women, desperate and furious, began to demand action. By the second day, Petrograd was in chaos. Workers across the city had joined the march, leaving factories silent. Tramlines stopped as drivers abandoned their routes. Shops closed their doors, and even students left their desks to flood into the streets. Petrograd was grinding to a halt. The crowds were growing larger, louder, and angrier. The chants for bread soon turned into something more dangerous. By March 10th, the demonstrations weren't just about hunger. They were a rejection of everything the empire had stood for. The mood in the city shifted. This wasn't a simple protest anymore. It was becoming a revolution. Far from Petrograd, at his military headquarters in Mogilev, Tsar Nicholas II was receiving reports about the unrest. At first, he dismissed them as exaggerated, but as telegrams poured in, the tone became impossible to ignore. Nicholas, finally alarmed, issued his order: crush the demonstrations at all costs. Troops were dispatched to the streets of Petrograd, rifles in hand. Their orders were clear: fire on the crowds, if necessary. Columns of soldiers marched into the city, rifles glinting in the cold, their boots striking the cobblestones in unison. These were young men, many of them barely out of their teens, clad in heavy woolen uniforms, their faces set in grim determination. As they reached the streets where the protesters had gathered, they raised their weapons. The crowds froze. For a moment, it seemed like the protests would end here, in blood. Tsar Nicholas had made his orders clear: crush the demonstrations. The soldiers knew what that meant. It wouldn't be the first time the Tsar's forces had opened fire on unarmed civilians. The protesters didn't scatter. They stood their ground, staring down the barrels of the guns. The officers barked orders, their voices sharp and commanding, but the rifles didn't move. The young recruits hesitated, their hands trembling. The faces in the crowd weren't strangers. They were familiar, too familiar. Women who looked like their own mothers, men who could have been their brothers. These weren't enemies. These were their people. And then the silence broke. The first rifle was lowered, then another and another. The soldiers weren't obeying. Some turned their guns on their officers, their anger boiling over. Others dropped their weapons and stepped forward, joining the crowd they had been sent to suppress. The streets erupted in cheers and cries of relief. The army, the Tsar's last line of defense, was mutinying. Across the city, barracks began to fall into chaos. Soldiers refused orders, deserted their posts, and flooded into the streets. Columns of armed men joined the protesters, their red banners fluttering alongside the workers. Petrograd was no longer under the Tsar's control. In that moment, Nicholas's reign was effectively over. By March 15, 1917, Tsar Nicholas II, isolated and powerless, signed his abdication. It wasn't a choice, it was survival. The empire he had ruled by divine right for over 2 decades was gone, dismantled in a matter of days. With no loyal army left and the streets of Petrograd in the hands of revolutionaries, Nicholas surrendered not just his throne, but the centuries-long reign of the Romanov dynasty. He and his family would soon be placed under house arrest, marking the end of Imperial Russia. The seeds of the October Revolution, led by Lenin and the Bolsheviks, were already being sown. The February Revolution, sparked by the people of Petrograd, had set in motion a chain of events that would redefine not only Russia, but the entire world.
Reviewing the parade is the man of iron, Stalin.
This wasn't just the end of an empire, it was the start of a new era. The February Revolution laid the foundations for socialism, the Soviet Union, and decades of ideological battles that would shape the 20th century. The revolution began with a cry for bread, but it ended with the fall of the Romanovs. History was made not by generals or politicians, but by hungry women who stood up and refused to be ignored.